Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to another webinar of the Life Science Acceleration Alliance. We're happy to have you with us. And with great pleasure, I would like to introduce John Standford, our guest. John Standford is the Executive Director of the Incubate Coalition, what we consider a sister organization of the Life Science Acceleration Alliance. We represent the same constituency, albeit to different governments and in different frameworks. John is a government relations professional and public affairs professional, with experience leading multi-year advocacy and awareness campaigns. He has long-standing relationships on Capitol Hill. He's a true insider, and he will share his knowledge about the Inflation Reduction Act with us today. John also provides regular commentary on key issues around innovation and the economy, including in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, CNBC, and has been featured on cable television. Welcome, John, to our webinar. Let's start with the opening question because it's a massive law that we're talking about. It is something that is called a landmark law with far-reaching consequences for people living in the United States and also probably internationally. Part of it deals with the price reduction in prescription drugs. John, what does that mean? Can you explain to our audience what the potential impact is or what already is known of the impact of that law?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for being here. As Rainer described, where we really are sort of sister organizations, bringing that voice of the early stage life science to our respective capitals for the benefit of policymaking. I thought I would just level set. I know we've got some very informed biopharmaceutical leaders on the phone, but I thought I'd do a quick level set of what was in the law, share a few details, and then really open it up for discussion and more questions. In a past life, I was a high school math teacher in the United States, so I was very used to interruptions, and I prefer by far good dialogue and discussion. If I say something along the way, don't wait till the end. Please jump in with any questions. So with that, I'll share my screen. Well, I've really just simplified it as much as possible into 2 slides. And we recently did a full detailed presentation with Incubate and our colleagues over at DLA Piper. So if you would like additional detail and really get into the weeds of the law, as well as some of the provisions outside of just the drug pricing negotiations, I encourage you to check out the entire conversation at incubatecoalition.org. But I'll start with sort of the key takeaways. The Inflation Reduction Act really had 4 major components related to the biopharmaceutical community. And we have to remember this law has a lot to do with American politics. It was passed only with Democratic support. And there were some constraints within the US policymaking process that played out in myriad ways. But it makes a massive investment in climate policy. And it also addressed a handful of social issues in the United States that had a price tag of about $700 billion. Well, in order to move this legislation forward, they had to pay for a good chunk of that. And the drug pricing provisions of the legislation are primarily used to offset a lot of that spending, ranging from about $200 to $300 billion over the next 10 years. And so at the very first, when I talk with folks in this industry, the first thing to think about is the consequence of any industry that has had $200 or $300 billion of revenue over the next decade being pulled out of it. So we'll talk about what we think are some very concrete consequences of the law. And thanks for that great question, Rainer. But big picture, this is a lot of money coming out of industry to pay for other government policies. On the left, you can see there are 4 main components. The first is direct price negotiation. Though quite frankly, from Incubate's perspective, it is most certainly a price control. As I'll talk about briefly, this really is not a negotiated process. This is a price control that will be set by the federal government. That's certainly the most talked about part of the law. But the law also will impact everyone on this call it will be setting sort of a maximum price increase that pharmaceutical companies can use in the American market each year and set that to the price of inflation. It'll limit out-of-pocket costs, which in the United States have been skyrocketing and have driven a lot of frustration with the healthcare system. For seniors in our Medicare Part D program, it will limit their out-of-pocket cost to $2,000 a year. It also addresses some insulin and vaccine policy. And then finally, very much in the weeds for any American policy wonks, is a redesign of our Medicare Part D. So there are 4 provisions, but almost all of the energy is spent talking about that first one. When we think about what is going to happen because of this, we really think there are probably 7 consequences, and those are captured in those boxes on the right. The first is the individual cost for patients will go down if they're a Medicare patient. Now, for non-Medicare, there will not be as much of a consequence. So if you think of a cystic fibrosis product, which is typically being taken by a younger adult or in a pediatric case, that will not really be affected because Medicare is not doing the purchasing. In the US, Medicare primarily serves ages 65 and above. It will drive down cost for the federal government. That's the whole point of these provisions. Those are 2 good things, generally speaking, the government spending less, patients spending less, but there are some really harmful consequences. Investment in types of medicines impacted by the Inflation Reduction Act is going to go down. We are likely to see reduction in investments in not just branded medicines, but in the generic and biosimilar process as well. We think this will have spillover effects into the private market in the US. It may require additional discussion about the development of evidence, real-world evidence in price setting. And then most consequentially, potentially, is this is going to happen very fast. And with that in mind, we don't have a lot of opportunity to shape the process. I'll share one more slide and then turn it back over for questions. I've gotten a lot of questions in the last couple of weeks about the process here. And so this is how, generally speaking, this will work. Beginning right around now, CMS is going to name a set of drugs that it has selected for negotiation. And again, I put negotiation in quotes, and then a 2-year process will establish a maximum fair price. Now, in theory, they are meant to take into account the following negotiation factors. You can see all of them listed there. But the number one that we've heard about is the cost of production. What's unfortunate is they are not taking very much into account failed products. And so from the early stage ecosystem, investors know that 9 out of 10 of their investments may go nowhere. That's not going to be a factor into the final price. And so we see this incongruence in policy where the government's going to be setting a price only on the winners, but the market has to deal with the reality of the losers. And that's very concerning. So they'll negotiate for roughly 2 years, and then it will go into place. We have 2 timelines here. So let's talk about who's eligible for this. It's for drugs that have been on the market for small molecule products for 7 years when the negotiation starts and 9 years when the negotiation ends. So small molecules, you'll hear a lot of talk about 9 years. Biologics, in a sort of a really disappointing turn of events, will have 13 years. And it's not bad that biologics have 13 years. At Incubate, we usually talk about 12 to 14 years of recouping investment. So 13 is there, but it's that differential between small molecule and biologics, which may disincentivize investment in small molecule products, which we know have so much promise remaining in areas like oncology. In addition, small molecule is very easy to go generic, whereas we're still struggling with how biologics can become biosimilars. So I certainly have a handful more slides. We can get into which drugs do we think will be first, but I wanted to level set to start the conversation. So I'll go ahead and stop there, and we can continue with some questions.
Yeah, thank you, John, for this introduction. Let's say that for the moment, this is definitely a law for America. And why should our European investors who are attending this webinar today should be interested in what would be the impact for the European investors at this stage?
Well, we have to remember what the United States market represents in the broader global pharmaceutical context. Depending on which therapeutic area, you're talking about 50 to 60% of the global market. So I believe investors in the life sciences space around the world, including hearing from friends in Japan and Singapore and others, are very concerned that the largest market for pharmaceutical products is shrinking potentially substantially. And so companies that are being invested in Europe, or European investors who likely have invested in some American companies, will feel the consequences of this. And it's that differential that America pays more for drugs that drove a lot of the political conversation around this legislation. So I think the consequences for any investor, it's very rare that an investor would not be prioritizing the American market when it comes to drugs. And this is the biggest shakeup to the American pharmaceutical market since the Medicare Part D program was created in 2003. So this is a radical change to how the US purchases a vast amount of drugs.
John, you have talked, I'm sure, to your advisory board. You've talked to other representatives of venture capital firms. What is their take on the law? Will there be any immediate actions taken, or is the fight still ongoing? I mean, the law has been passed. What is the mood in the industry?
The mood in industry is very frustrated, and I won't speak for the manufacturers at the very end. They're well represented in Washington. I primarily focus on the early stage ecosystem, and I think everyone is quite frustrated. There are a lot of places where this legislation shows a disconnect with the sort of economic and market realities of this process. Again, I'll point back to the 9 and 13-year difference. Some of my board members who we represent some of the major VC funds in the United States, they were focusing on small molecule oncology products. That was a heavy part of their portfolio. And this concept that they will now have a far shorter time to recoup that investment is concerning. And so I think people are beginning to move from a wait and see approach to now beginning to really think about the consequences for their individual portfolios, and will they begin to operate differently or make different funding decisions. There are specifics that are excluded, and I should touch on those. This only applies to drugs that do not have generic or biosimilar competition after those timeframes. So I think a lot of companies are evaluating whether or not generics or biosimilars are expected to come to the market. But if you think about cell and gene therapy, which I know so many folks on the phone are investors in sort of the breakthrough cell and gene therapies, we haven't thought about what that means to have a comparator product because of how personalized that medicine is. So we have a lot more questions than we have answers I would say that's how all of industry feels. CMS, the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services in the US, which will oversee this project, are hiring a substantial number of people out of the payer the payer negotiations in order to operationalize this. And so I think we're all wondering how this is going to play out. I am sure there will be some maneuvers to try to minimize the impact, but a lot of folks are sort of trying to establish where the most immediate impact's going to be. I should also say there is a temporary small biotech exclusion, but that exclusion is temporary. And so when I talk to venture capitalists, they don't value it as substantially because it is temporary. And then there's some other real disincentives here, particularly in the oncology space. Your drug is not subject to negotiation if it's an orphan drug or it only has a singular indication. But what we've seen in the cancer space is so many products having multiple indications. And there will now be a disincentive. If you have a really successful lung cancer product, you are now disincentivized to go explore whether or not that could be helpful in kidney or pancreatic, and products that treat the blood-brain barrier. Those are the small molecule ones. There's a host of disincentives here that are potentially going to change what people invest in. And that's pretty concerning, and it's happening in an environment. We just got some exciting news out of for the Alzheimer's community, I think, but it's also happening in an environment where accelerated approval is under scrutiny in the United States. And so there's a lot of confusion about what's going to happen next, and then companies are deciding what rational steps to take.
All right, and that makes me thinking about this question: in which way this new law make it more difficult for the biotech to attract the much needed capital to develop new drugs and treatments? Can you give us an idea on this?
Yeah, I've spoken with some biotech CEOs who are concerned. I mean, in the United States, you have to remember our biotech market is in pretty rough shape as it is. The sort of broader economic headwinds have made it a really capital constrained environment. It was very bullish for several years there. And so whether this is just a correction in the industry, it comes at a really challenging time. So many companies are seeking out capital at a time when those markets are constrained. I think as funds and as investors react to this law, capital will flow. We always talk about capital will flow like water. The capital is going to flow where it's the easiest. And there may be therapeutic areas not impacted by this law where capital still is available and quite easy to get. We have some concerns for the amount of capital that will be deployed in the therapeutic areas most impacted by this law. To put a specific name on it, neurological, blood-brain barrier, small molecule products. They primarily are going to be in an older population, so Medicare affected, check. They're also only going to get 9 years of protection, check. And outside of this law, there's a deeper question about the amount of approval and whether or not those products will be paid for in the US following the Aduhelm sort of decision at CMS and their non-coverage decision. So when you add all of that up, if you're an investor, you're going to start pricing in risk in certain therapeutic areas, and we know that capital will move elsewhere, and that's concerning. I'm not sure the law will lead to the emptying of funds overnight, but when everyone has agreed, the Congressional Budget Office, the Biden administration, which helped push this law, industry, this will lead to fewer products. Now, some in the US argued that's okay. We don't need as many products, but we don't know if in the last 10 or Vital Transformations had a study that more than 150 products will be lost. We don't know if that's where the treatment or cure for Alzheimer's is. We don't know which of those. We do know platform technologies. We think about mRNA and all of its value in the COVID environment. Well, imagine now you have an mRNA product. You are disincentivized to explore additional indications. So when I talk to companies that are offering platform solutions, well, they're very concerned about, well, which indication should I be pursuing first? Is this changing my go-to-market strategy? And I think those are questions we'll still have to answer. Anytime you have to ask more questions, the cost of capital goes up and there will be less of it. And that's concerning.
Yeah, thank you, John. That's a very good analysis, and in a sense, disconcerting for what is going on in the EU at the moment. There's an in-depth review of pharma legislation that the Commission is undertaking. The timeline has been pushed back a bit, as it usually is with very complex matters where many constituencies are involved. We're now looking at hopefully potentially a final version in March, but the review process is mostly done. What is your take on lessons learned from the legislative process over there? What is it that the EU Commission should really be careful in doing or not doing? It sounds like it was a lot of backroom dealings in a sense to try to get this through, and there were some casualties on the way, and one of the big casualties is what you just described. So what would be the lessons learned from your viewpoint?
Well, I think there are several consequences that'll come out of this that will actually play out in Europe. The first being what happens in the American market. Now, in the European Union, many of the markets have price controls will be nothing new to them. And in fact, talking with some of my European colleagues, they sort of said, well, welcome to the universe that is price controls. We have to think that if the biggest market for products is being changed substantially, that will have consequences in other markets. Does that mean there'll be increased pressures on manufacturers to recover lost American profit abroad? We don't know. Powers that are economists and professors, I think, will be debating that, and we'll see over the next couple of years. But I think what I would want the EU policymakers to see here is there's real economic cost and there's real patient cost to some of these decisions. American biopharmaceutical leadership for a long time has been a pride of the entire country. We've developed not just sort of the shining cities on the hill of Cambridge, Massachusetts, the Research Triangle in North Carolina, the Bay Area and San Diego in California, but life sciences has become embedded as a major part of the American economy all the way through advanced manufacturing. I'm not sure policymakers fully appreciated just how successful that industry is in the United States. So Europe could be taking the perspective that this could be an opportunity if there is a weakened American biopharmaceutical infrastructure. Is this an opportunity for Europe to reestablish itself as it was many decades ago as a primary source? We know that China will certainly be seeing this as an opportunity. And so I think, if the amount of US investment is likely to decrease, is there an opportunity for Europe to build a really warm environment for the early stage ecosystem? And I know that's the great work that LSAA is doing. And then there's patient consequence here. Will we see a world where EMA can offer additional indications that companies don't pursue in the United States because of this law? Perhaps. So again, I think that's an opportunity for European patients. I think the EU would be wise to really consider the pharmaceutical legislation they're looking at in the context of a diminished American market and pursue legislation that's an opportunity for an industry, whether that's more commercialization at the academic level, whether that's making a warmer environment for investment. I know within several of your markets, there's actually a process to shift entrepreneurs over to the American markets for capital reasons. Well, is this an opportunity to reverse that trend? By all means, we want to see the best and brightest biotechs coming to America's shores so that our venture capitalists can fund them. But I do think there's an opportunity for Europe to get this right. And I think getting that pharmaceutical legislation is going to set the tone for Europe for, the decade to come. You all consider this legislation slowly and infrequently. And so I think it'd be important to get it right and really deliberate on what the consequences are, because no one knows exactly what the consequences in the US will look like. And there's also a lot of lessons to learn. I think we'll all be in the US doing diligence on HTA models that have worked or not worked, what benefits patients the most, and how do we make sure that, again, patients are front and center in this conversation. And I think if you speak to the oncology community, they don't feel like they were front and center in this legislation. So that'd be my other advice to the European markets, is get the patients out front, because I think the oncology community is quite concerned that there's going to be decreased exploration of secondary indications or even small molecule investment. Sorry, that was a long answer, Rainer, maybe more than you bargained for.
Well, that's okay. One thing that I really found stood out for me is that it's clearly not understood how important the role of risk capital is in the early stages of developing drugs that may really have a major impact. You talked about mRNA technology, when we're looking at the vaccines, when we're looking at really rare diseases, when we're looking at new approaches, new molecules that can really make a big difference in the health of patients. Those things are not really understood. I mean, it's not surprised, because it's a complex business. It is a very sort of far away part of what a politician looks at. Typically, policymakers looking at the big drugs, big pharma, they're looking at the overall costs and don't really realize what these very important early stage investments can have and should have as an impact going forward, and how much can be destroyed by taking decisions to go left instead of staying in the middle. That is part of what we have to do and what we have to focus on to really get that message across. And so far, thank you very much for sharing your insight.
I would just say I'm so excited for what LSAA is doing. I will say Incubate was created 5 years ago because venture capital was standing on the sidelines. I think for too long, we all believed we could sort of hide behind the strong presence of manufacturers in the government process. But that's not the case anymore. If you're invested, and I don't just mean financially, in a life sciences community, you have an obligation to be an advocate because the headwinds against this industry are substantial, but it's the only industry that can have such a meaningful impact in the lives of all of us. And someday we will all be patients if we're not already. And so, Incubate was able to shape some provisions of this law. There were much worse proposals along the way, but there is a real disconnect with policymakers. We assume policymakers understand the economics and the realities of drug development, and they don't. And so everyone should take an opportunity, whether it's through LSAA, a great coalition like that, or otherwise, to let policymakers know about their work. So thank you for the opportunity here today. We are happy to always be a resource on all things America to our friends across the Atlantic. So thanks for bringing Incubate in today.
Thank you, John.
Thanks for joining us. Thank you and goodbye.